So as far as what the email actually looks like, if it's a big company, we expect to see images, we expect to see product photos, or at least some kind of photo, some kind of graphic, some kind of logo. But with just the solopreneur marketer, the affiliate marketer, sometimes either that isn't really something they can do, or it's not applicable sometimes. I mean, I've done interviews, and again, we're talking about a few years ago, people would say actually text only will convert better than if you use all this HTML and all this image heavy graphics. So what are you finding works now? Does it depend on the niche, or is there an overriding rule that we can look at as far as how many images and graphics to use?
So I think it depends on the industry, and like we were saying, complex products versus simple products. What's the email actually selling? Something to take into account too is what email clients are they opening in, what percentage are opening on mobile, things like that. Does your metrics platform support those? If you can, then that'll give you a clearer picture of what your email should look like. So if 90% of your list, 80% is opening in something like a Gmail client, that's something where, okay, the images are going to pre-download. Let's use that to our advantage, right? Let's get that. Let's focus on using that as an advantage, and we'll test, text version versus something like that. Versus if you've got someone opening all your emails in Outlook, for example, it might make more sense to go with a text email because that's what you're seeing in Outlook anyway, right?
Another thing I think, before we even make the decision that we want to include images is, does this image actually convey any sort of value? Or is it just this stock image of something? Is it going to help someone make a decision? Do you have a product that is very visual, or that you want to show on the page, or are you a B2B business that you're going to be showing like your campus or something that really doesn't help the user make a decision? So it's kind of deciding whether images are even going to help you convey what you're trying to say in the first place, and then if you decide, then it's kind of moving on to, okay, what's our client base, what platforms are they using, etc.
So, yeah, exactly. Okay. You want to always, blend in analytics when you can, because that way you'll make a more informed decision.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, you mentioned mobile, and obviously that's a fairly new thing when we're discussing email marketing. It was not prevalent 5 to 10 years ago. So in what ways have you seen email marketing practices have to change because of the fact that a lot of people are looking at it on their mobile devices?
I mean, I can speak to this a little bit. I think that mobile's been interesting over the past, 3 years or so, just seeing it take off not only in email clients but also in just browsers and things like that. I remember looking at an analytics chart from when I started working here and to where I am now, and just seeing the percentages go from, depending on the business, from 5% to 35%, which is crazy. But with cell phones, with mobile phones and especially smartphones, the most important thing to remember is, is your email communicating in the same way that it would communicate in a desktop browser or a desktop client? Because there's a lot of companies you'll see out there that haven't adapted to a responsive template, haven't done things like that. And while that might be, like, for example, maybe in an e-commerce thing, that might be really important because your offer is fairly simple, but say your image isn't scaled right. So you can't even see the beautiful high-res Photoshop of this product. So that's one of the things that we've seen a ton of interest in from research partners, is just making sure that their emails are mobile optimized, because I think I saw a stat was between, like, depending on industry, 40 to 50% of emails now are getting opened on a mobile phone. I can't corroborate that that's completely accurate, but that's the thing. It's if people are opening on mobile phones a lot, then you need to make sure your email is optimized for that audience as well, and that your purchase funnel experience is optimized on that note as well.
Right, yeah, once you get them out of the email, it still has to be optimized. Okay, so you guys talked a lot about the subject line, which is essentially a call to action. It's a call to action for them to open the email. And, the curiosity factor, the urgency factor. Now, when it comes to the call to action to click out of the email, what sorts of words do you find that work really well to get from the email to the landing page?
Value-laden words, kind of something that's going to let them know what's coming next. You've seen work, if it's just, click here, or, click to see this. That's kind of just very neutral, doesn't really provide any value of why I should click, but things like, get instant access, that's the big one that Flint uses a lot.
Get $100 off now, something like
right.
that.
So something that they're going to get, something with value, and that very clearly communicates what they're going to see on the next page.
Yeah, and something to remember too is you see, there's a ton of emails that are fully clickable these days. So the whole email is just one big image. It's completely clickable. So one thing to not forget about in there is you're going to have copy directing visitors, what we would call a process of a value proposition. Right? What's the next step? So even though you've got a full page, a full screen email, you still might want to have part of that image be a call to action button, even though they don't necessarily have to click on that button to go to the next step.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, obviously, you guys are all about testing and tracking and experimenting, and marketers talk about testing and tracking a lot. It's something that they know they should do, but the more I talk to people, the more I realize that very few actually do it. It's like going back to school and having to do math class or something. Like, people don't actually like testing. How important is it actually to be testing and tracking in order to optimize what we're doing with email marketing?
I'd say unless you're a psychic, it's extremely important. We typically assume that we are the average consumer, which is completely inaccurate. So usually what we think is valuable, or what we think should be the next step, or what we think the image should be, may not be what our customer agrees with. So without testing it, you're just kind of making a lot of assumptions that are probably, at least some of them are incorrect. So until you test it, you don't really know what's going to work, best for your company and your audience.
Mm-hmm. So we talk about creating customer theory and really using those tests to develop a key customer theory.
Exactly.
It might be I remember a blog about it being a never-ending journey, but the thing is when you keep learning, you keep driving results, you're learning about your customer the whole time.
Right, okay. So what kind of testing do you recommend as a bare minimum and as an optimum?
I mean, I think that's it depends on your organization's needs. So if you have the bandwidth to incorporate some testing into your either email marketing or your other digital marketing channels, like your website, it's something that I think you want to start, especially if you're a new person at it. Start simple. There's lots of online testing platforms that are free out there. If it is your email platform, you need to actually look into it and see, okay, do I have the ability to split test in here? If so, maybe you start with a couple simple split tests. Subject lines you can usually validate more because there's so much more traffic seeing that subject line and opening than actually clicking through in the email. So you also need to look at your numbers and understand, where does it even make sense for me to start testing? If you're only getting a 5% open rate on your whole list, it might make sense to try to drive more people into that top of the funnel and get to the open versus saying, okay, let's focus on the body of the email now, because you might only be getting a couple hundred people into that actual email, right?
Yeah, I would say at a minimum, anytime people go to make large site changes or something like that, I would definitely test that first, because last thing you want is to invest a bunch of money in something and then just launch it and find out that it performs terribly. So at a minimum, testing those big site changes or email changes, and then optimal would be asking yourself, well, what don't I know about my customer? What don't I know is performing? What do I want to learn about the customer? What do I want to learn about how I'm speaking to them? And just make a list of those questions and find ways to test each of those questions to get an answer to them, to build what Tanner was saying is that customer learning and customer theory.
Okay, so basically we should start by focusing on where our trouble is. So if we want more emails opened, we focus on the subject line. And from what I understand, we should only be testing one thing at a time, right? Like, if we're testing the subject line, it's two different subject lines, but the body of the email is exactly the same?
Well, it depends on what your variable or what you're trying to learn. So if you're trying to learn, this entire approach to the way there's approach A that I speak to about my product, which may be, let's say, a sale, whereas approach B is more, let's just communicate the value of the product.
Okay.
Just subject line testing, which is the cleanest way to test it, but it could be something that you need to pull throughout the entire funnel, and you're testing subject line in email versus subject line in email. So it just depends on what you're trying to learn and what your strategy is. But just knowing that, you know, it may have been the subject line, it may have been the email. The more variables you add, the harder it is to tell which detail made the difference.
Right.
You can't pin it down to one and say,
Exactly.
you know, all day it'll be, which variable caused this test to do this? Well, you tested 3 variables, so we're not sure which one it is, but you saw there's a learning around the approach anyway.
You know this approach performs the best.
But with that being
Right.
said, you can look at it from a perspective, okay, one, you know, we're going to test one subject line, We're going to learn from the open rate what we need to learn from this email. There's also an approach where, you know, say you have 3 different subject lines and then you have 3 different templates you want to try in that process. As long as you're testing, you know, as long as you're aggregating the data and looking at how they perform against each other, you can run tests like that as well and get kind of compound learnings. It's all dependent on, you know, how big's your list, how much traffic you have, things like that, that would allow you to run tests of that format.
Okay, so if I was doing that, would I have 3 different subject lines, and then under each individual subject line, I have the 3 different content variables?
Yeah, and that's
Okay.
that's pretty much like a multivariate test. So you can kind of have things interchanging, and so you get all options together.
Yeah, so yeah, it's just multiple variables involved in that test, and that way you could then look at, say, hey, I have subject line 1, and then I have content body 1, 2, and 3, right? And then you'd have a subject line 2, and then the same thing. So if you wanted to look at subject line performance, subject lines, they're not seeing anything before that subject line. So you can measure the subject line just based on that. But then you can also get to the ideal subject line and content format, and then you could also then dice it again and look at, oh man, well, 1 did the best in click-through across all of these. And then you can kind of compound some learnings, get a good hypothesis for your next test, and then follow up with an even stronger second test.
Yeah, that is a little bit more complicated, but you can get very specific learnings, but you definitely need to have a large list or traffic to do tests like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right, exactly. Okay, but ultimately, I know if the open rate increased on one, it had to be the subject line because they didn't see anything else before they opened it, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Okay, and then if the click-through rate increases, it may have been the subject line, it may have been the content, it may have been the call to action, it may have been a combination.
Exactly. That's why you got to look at different. You know, I think click-through is typically defined as like delivered to clicks.
Yeah.
So you also want to look at your metrics. You want to look at obviously opens.
Right.
You want to look at opens to clicks, things of that nature too, just to make sure that you're looking at the different variables that could be a factor, or each step in the funnel, the email funnel.
Okay, and how should the list be split? Should it be just totally random?
Well, I guess it depends on the test. I mean, sometimes we'll segment out a portion of the list that we want to send it to, depending on what kind of test it is.
Okay.
So, you know, if we were running a test for Summit, we may want to only send an optimization Summit email to people who have indicated that they're interested in online testing. So we may like take that segment of the email, but once we've done that, deciding what people get what treatments has to be completely random, and that's part of making sure that you have a valid test is that random sampling.
Yeah, and then randomizing, like one thing, especially with email, I mean, there's one thing, landing page testing, you kind of have a flow of traffic, which is good. Email, you're doing, you know, you're sending, you're batching your sends. So some of the tips that some of the best practices I've adopted a little bit is with email testing, if you can test multiple times across that same list and randomize it across multiple sends, try to do that, and that way you can smooth out your results a little bit. Yeah. Another thing too would be if you have an extremely active, like say you have a list of 1 million people, but really 200,000 people are the only ones that are interacting with your list. That might be another split you might consider, or Liz Lawrence said, you might segment that population out, run some tests on them, because that's your 80-20 rule right there. That 20% is making up 80% of the activity on your list. So you might want to segment out, run a test on them instead of just randomizing the whole list, because then you're going to get you might get more of those people in one treatment than you would in another treatment. Does that make sense? And
another thing to think about would be kind of thinking ahead and how many tests you plan to run, how many emails you plan to send. Because if you're testing on your 100% of your list every single week, like you may be sending way too many emails to these people. So if you have a big enough list, you know, run the test on 10% this week, and then, you know, 10% the next week, or whatever that percentage is, but just thinking ahead of how many emails you're planning to send, and do you want all of your people to get every single one of those emails?